Combat and World of Warcraft go hand in hand, whether it's PvP, defeating the latest raid boss, or just being out there farming some gold. It's something that we all have tons of experience with just through playing the game. And World of Warcraft is a game that has embraced the holy trinity of combat within MMOs as well, that being we have classes that heal, ones that tank, and ones that DPS. Each spec has their designated roles by Blizzard, and that's what they do. Or is it? Over the years, people have experimented with different class abilities, talents, and gear options to the extent where they found different and brand new ways to play the class, which oftentimes don't appear to be the obviously dev-intended way to do so. And that is what I want to talk about today. One weird or unusual way to play each class within the game that's been done in a way which defies the meta and what is expected of that particular class or spec. Now, as you'll soon hear about, more often than not, these unusual player-made creations came out during the earlier versions of World of Warcraft, and this was largely down to the old unrestricted talent trees where you could put points wherever you wanted, and primary stats and a few other factors were different then, which made things generally a bit more flexible. As such, I'll be leaving out the Monk, Demon Hunter and Evoker for this, but if you do know of any off-meta playstyles for these classes which you think would have fit, let me know for sure, because for the other classes I had more than a few choices, and we can always do a part 2. But with all that said, let's begin and go over one off-meta spec for each class throughout World of Warcraft's history. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev gives ambitious, self-motivated individuals the tools to get fully on board with the Python and Go programming languages. What sets it apart from other learning programs is that it treats this process like it was an RPG, where you're in charge of goals, experience, achievements, and much more. This allows you to stay both engaged with the topic you're on and to keep progress of how far you've gotten. And Boot.dev believes in hands-on learning and a lot of it. One of the main things they'll have you doing is writing tons of your own code, so you can really get a first-hand understanding of what works and why. Boot.dev could very well end up being the start of something huge for you, so if it sounds interesting, why not check it out? You can click the link in the description box and use my code WILLE to get 25% off your first payment for Boot.dev. That'll be 25% your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription you choose. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the continued support on the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. Starting off with the plate wearers, we have the Warrior. For Warrior, I picked a unique spec that this class had during one expansion, a lesser played expansion for sure, Warlords of Draenor, and here I'm of course talking about Gladiator Stance. Gladiator Stance was a new talent added for Protection Warriors, which would basically aim to take the whole Protection spec and instead of it being a tank, turn it into a DPS instead. When you pick this talent, it would increase physical damage by 20%, and replace your shield block with shield charge, which when used would increase the damage of shield slam, revenge and heroic strike by 30% for 6 seconds. It was such a cool class fantasy to be a shield wearing DPS for once, and not something we'd seen before in World of Warcraft. But this spec ended up having problems. First of all, for a DPS spec, it just wasn't very good compared to Arms or Fury when it came to doing damage on a warrior, and that went for both PvE and PvP. And if we look back to Warcraft logs and check out the top 5% of how people performed on each spec, Gladiator Warrior is not sitting too favourably on any of these lists for the raid tiers that WoD had, with both Fury and Arms oftentimes being far ahead of this new class identity. And picking a spec which is sitting so far below your other options really just isn't a choice a lot of people are going to make more than once. Blizzard would give some context as to why they removed this talent when they did so in Legion, roughly saying that leaving Glad Stance as a sub-spec of a talent tree restricted how much they could really do with it, and it created a conflict between building a defensive Protection Warrior spec and an offensive shield-wearing Warrior spec. Now I think the obvious comparison here is Feral from Vanilla to Kata, where both DPS and tanking worked in the same talent tree, but by Warlords of Draenor of course, you only get 1 talent point per 15 levels instead of 1 per level, so a lot of your class's baseline sublime power had to be obtained when you first picked your spec. Then again, recently in Season of Discovery, Blizzard have brought back the fan favourite of Gladiator Warrior. So is it doing better in Molten Core at all? Well, when I went to check it out, it was not even listed as a DPS spec. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably not doing so hot, and people are just playing Fury and Vanilla as they always have done. At this point, Gladiator Warrior probably does need a full-on 4th spec if it's ever going to properly work. But for a time, the Gladiator Warrior, this shield-wielding DPS spec, was a thing, and maybe one day it will be a thing again. For Paladin, there was a unique spec during Wrath of the Lich King which would prove an amazing hybrid between a DPS and a healer called the Preg Paladin. It was named after the player who supposedly invented it. This variation of Paladin was a mix between Retribution and Protection, and would really lean into the Paladin's hybrid identity, whilst also putting out some great damage and heals. The big difference between this and your standard Rep Pally was that instead of using a two-handed weapon, you did in fact rock a shield and a fast one-handed weapon for damage. Over in the Retribution tree, the talent The Art of War would give you an instant cast Exorcism or Flash of Light every single time your melee attack crit, and with a fast one-handed weapon and the Reckoning talent in the proc tree, this thing would proc basically non-stop, so you had loads of instant casts. You would be using Judgment and Shield of the Righteous for your main damage sources, and it still had all that great Paladin utility from Hand of Protection, Freedom, Hammer of Justice, and so on. And this spec could absolutely bully melee-focused comps due to its highly sustained damage output, as well as, well, it was kind of a tank at the same time. It was just really difficult to do damage to them. Even during Wrath Classic, this spec found a whole bunch of viability in PvP, and could be a real annoyance to deal with due to their ability to be a true hybrid between a DPS and a healer. In Kata though, Paladins changed a bunch and got Holy Power, which modified how they dealt damage, and you couldn't just put talents wherever you wanted anymore. You had to have spent a full 31 points before unlocking your other 2 specs to spend your remaining points. So in short, this spec just didn't make sense anymore. But during Wrath, Paladin had one of the most true, unique hybrid specs we have ever seen for PvP. Staying with the plate wearers, we have the Death Knight as well as another entry from the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, and that is for Blood Death Knight DPS. Early on in Wrath of the Lich King, as you may well know, Death Knights were truly on a different level to every other class. They were Blizzard's hero class after all, and it really felt like you were playing a cheat character that you unlocked after having beat the game or something. Early on, each spec didn't have their roles set in stone, so of course people experimented with different ways to play this new class, and one of those more successful experimentations early on was for Blood DPS. In terms of what abilities they used, it's pretty similar to what Blood DK ended up being in Wrath Classic, with their diseases, Death Coil as a spender, and of course most of the time you spammed Heart Strike, which for some reason stopped the target from benefiting from haste effects instead of cleaving nearby targets. But the biggest deal for the old Blood DK was Dancing Rune Weapon. Dancing Rune Weapon was why this spec did damage, and the first version of it that we had was crazy good. First of all, Dancing Rune Weapon would snapshot all of your active buffs, and you wanted to have as many buffs as possible before you activated it. It also had its duration extended based upon how much runic power that you spent on it, instead of lasting a fixed duration, so you really needed to set everything up at the start of the fight. It also copied everything that you did, including Raise Dead and even Army of the Dead. But biggest of all is that it dealt the exact same damage that the Death Knight did. In a later patch, Blizzard would nerf it so it copied 50% of the damage. But back during the start of Wrath, Dancing Rune Weapon straight up just doubled your damage. You combine this with a frankly very undertuned tier 8 and a revisit from Naxxramas where bosses just fell over, and DKs ended up with high uptime on their cooldowns because of this, so this would often see them towards the top of DPS meters alongside other burst heavy classes and specs such as the Arcane Mage. And we absolutely did not get this experience in Wrath Classic, with final patch balancing. Death Knights were a whole different beast than what they were in 2008. So was Blood DK just a total meme in Wrath Classic then? I mean, well, kind of, yeah. It was never the best DPS spec at any point for Death Knights to go to, but as we progressed through the tiers, it did start to improve, with the first time of it showing signs of life being during Trial of the Grand Crusader, and by Icecrown Citadel, well, with a Shadow Morn, it was actually doing fairly respectable damage. Wasn't topping the meters by any means, but they could definitely pull their weight. Of course, in Cataclysm, Blizzard would redesign Blood DK into the official tanking spec, which, to be fair, it already was for the vast majority of players in Wrath, but for a while, a long time ago, Blood DK was genuinely a top tier DPS. Let's stay in Wrath of the Lich King, shall we? Those big talent trees led to so much experimentation, and that was true for our first male-wearing class, the Enhancement Shaman. So Enhancement's always been a mix between physical and magical damage, and it really leaned into that class fantasy during Wrath of the Lich King when it came to certain gearing options. The first variation of Enhancement was known as Spellhance. What this meant is instead of your gearing being focused around agility and attack power based stats, certain item slots could contain caster items, notably your main hand and off pieces such as your neck, rings and cloak. On top of that, early on in Wrath Classic, people playing Spellhance didn't even use Wind Fury weapon on their main hand. Instead, they favoured two different ranks of Flame Tongue weapon between their offhand and main hand to maximise on its spell damage scaling, as well as to take advantage of Glyph of Flame Tongue for extra crit bonus. This spec would also boast good AoE through Fire Nova, as well as spending Maelstrom procs on Chain Lightning. Of course, some of the BIS pieces were incredibly contested by basically every single caster already, so getting your hands on items such as the Ring of Manifested Pain from Kel'Thuzad or Dying Curse were not going to be easy, and in fact would probably cause a lot of drama, but the results that Spellhance could put out were solid, with it often being a class that found them towards the upper end of damage meters. And BIS gear throughout Wrath of the Lich King for Enhancement kept featuring spell power items too, which really pushed this unique gearing style. But wait, there is more. There was also another Shaman variation experimented with called Heal Hands, where the idea was to utilize major glyphs and Maelstrom procs on healing abilities rather than always spending them on damage. This was more of a flex pick between a DPS and a healer, where it enabled the Shaman to be a true hybrid between the two, but if for whatever reason you just needed a bit of extra heals here and there, this spec could very much work, though Heal Hands really excelled in content which you already overgeared a decent amount and didn't need as many on-demand heals to really require another full-on healer. All the same, Wrath had both Spellhance and Heal Hands, and I think they're both worthy of a mention. Next up is the Hunter, and for them I'm picking a playstyle which really only existed during Vanilla and TBC called Melee Weaving. So back in these first two versions of World of Warcraft, the Hunter's ranged and melee swing timers were tracked separately. This meant you could shoot your ranged weapon, run into melee during which time your ranged weapon swing timer is recovering, hit your melee attack or raptor strike, run back out, use your next ranged auto attack, and repeat as of when needed. There were some variables on this too, such as your melee and ranged weapon speeds, haste procs, and various other effects which complicated your swing timer, which made effective melee weaving have an extremely high skill cap, but when executed well, it was truly a thing of beauty to watch. In fact, when people talk about specs which are difficult to play in the early versions of World of Warcraft, I think a melee weaving hunter in TBC is genuinely the most difficult, despite it never really being talked about all that much. Now, as much as melee weaving was possible in vanilla, it was never really popular for several reasons. One reason was, hunters kind of just did damage in Molten Core and then they fell off really hard scaling wise, and for you to melee weave effectively, you needed a spot in a group with Wind Fury, which means you're competing for that spot with all your guild's rogues and warriors, and both of them could do a lot more damage with a lot less effort, and you needed Wind Fury because, kind of goes without saying, but if you're melee weaving, you always want a slow two-handed weapon, so when you do step into hit, you're getting as much damage as possible. The bigger reason though was just the downtime which it caused in vanilla. In vanilla, ranged attacks needed you to be 8 yards away from your target, and to melee be within 5 yards, so each melee weave really needed you to take a few steps forwards and then run all the way back out again, which was just barely worth the effort even if done near perfectly, because ranged ranged weapons, of course, don't fire when you're moving. However, in TBC, Blizzard changed the minimum range of ranged weapons down from 8 yards to 5. Yes, it says 5 for both melee and ranged, but there is a very small difference between the two. This meant now you could just tap forwards and then tap backwards to melee weave, and it was very effective if done well. But of course, back then TBC hunters also had to deal with steady shot, which had to be weaved in between your regular auto attacks. So you had your ranged weapon swing timer, your steady shot, your melee swing timer, and your raptor strike cooldown, which you needed to balance out whilst also taking into account haste effects as well. The upside in TBC was, unlike vanilla, hunters did damage now, and with a very high level of melee weaving, they were pretty hard to beat, until you got to a boss with an absolutely terrible hitbox of course, and unfortunately there was a lot of those. Either way, melee weaving hunters were a unique and powerful way to play the class, which for me definitely peaked in TBC. On to our leather wearing classes next, and we will begin with the Rogue. A role that Rogue could find itself in during earlier versions of World of Warcraft could be of that of a tank. Now this wasn't exactly commonplace by any means. You wouldn't really sign up to a guild saying I'm a rogue tank and expect to be accepted. And we aren't talking about Season of Discovery here either, where Blizzard have made rogue tank into an official thing. This is rogue tank that just so happens to work purely via the circumstances. And the circumstances in question were A, the boss kind of just stands there and auto attacks you, and B, you have loads of gear and enough combined dodge and parry to ensure that you never take a direct hit, and for all intents and purposes you're a tank that's immune to damage. In fact, there have been kills of bosses in Naxxramas on hardcore realms using rogue tanks because they're just the most consistent tank. The bosses physically cannot hit them. Patchwork has been done with rogue tanks. Even Resuvius, who isn't supposed to be tanked, has been done with rogue tanks. And as long as your rogue can maintain a threat lead, it's very possible to have them fulfill this typically unavailable role to them. That being said, threat is the big problem here. See, as much as rogues can do good damage and therefore manage to generate a good amount of threat by themselves, they don't have the tools traditional tanks do, such as taunting abilities. So if a DPS messes up and overtakes you, it's kind of very difficult to fix the situation without just having a regular tank takeover. During the Burning Crusade, rogue tank was effective on some encounters too, especially Gruul the Dragon Slayer and Mother Shiraz in the Black Temple, where similar to Naxxramas, rogues could gear up enough to the point where they just straight up wouldn't be hit by auto attacks. In the Sunwell, rogues hypothetically would have been great on a number of fights too, but basically stat scaling was starting to get a bit out of hand, and even proper traditional feral druid tanks were hitting mitigation cap, or in other words, also becoming immune to auto attacks. Blizzard would end up putting an effect in the Sunwell called Sunwell Radiance, which gave enemies a 5% bonus to their hit chance and players a minus 20% to their dodge chance, which instantaneously killed any class fantasy the rogue tank had going. Even your regular tanks with full mitigation gear would get trucked by some bosses in the Sunwell. But rogue tank did used to be a thing, even before Season of Discovery, and providing your DPS could hold on for them to build threat, they could be very effective. For druids, it's not so much an off-meta spec that I'm picking, but more just the steps that they went through if they wanted to really min-max their feral spec during vanilla, because it was pretty excessive. So ferals worked in an entirely different way to any other melee class back then, because they didn't actually auto-attack with their weapon. Instead, they had a set auto-attack speed depending whether they were in bear or cat form, and their auto-attack damage was based off their stats, rather than being largely impacted by their weapon's damage and speed. This meant for feral druids specifically, their weapon wasn't really very important to actually improving their damage, and there was one weapon in particular from Nomragun which ended up being the best thing ferals could equip right up to early game in the Burning Crusade. It is an infamous weapon by this point called the Manual Crowd Pummeler. Where it was special is that it had an on-use effect that would grant 50% bonus to attack speed for 30 seconds when used, so this would massively increase the feral druid's attack speed and provide a larger damage increase than any other weapon choice in the game. It was even the best for tanking too, as it would give the greatest threat per second. The kicker on this item though is that it was limited to 3 charges, so if you really wanted to min-max, you had to go and farm these from inside Nomragun from the boss, appropriately named the Crowd Pummeler. You could get to this boss boss pretty easily via the back door of Gnomeregan, and that's exactly what you had to do. Oh, and it wasn't 100% drop chance either, and back then you could only do 5 instances per hour, so it was a big never-ending grind. But if you were min-maxing, that's just part of what you had to do, and that is not all you had to do either. Another technique that was used a lot was called power shifting. So back in vanilla, energy generation was different. Instead of it gradually regenerating by increments of 1 with its regeneration rate being affected by haste, instead you got 20 energy every 2-second intervals. And usually when you shift into cat form, you had 0 energy, but we can improve that. There are 2 things to take into account here. The Fiora talent over in the feral tree that would guarantee 20 energy when going into cat, as well as the Wolf's Head Helm, an item that would mirror this effect. So now when you enter cat, you instantly gain 40 energy. And if you time this alongside the global energy tick, you'll more or less instantly be up to 60 energy, at which point you can shred twice in a row, exit cat, and re-enter before the next energy tick, and repeat this process. So in short, power shift is spamming exit and enter cat form to gain more energy than you would have done if you just waited for it to regenerate naturally. It was mana intensive, however, and would need to be done correctly to really see the benefits. But when it comes to min-maxing a certain spec, few classes and specs had to do more than ferals did in vanilla. Finally, we have our cloth wearers with the Warlock first. Well, Season of Discovery may have made the Warlock tank into a real thing, but now and again the Warlock was called upon to tank certain raid encounters. But the Warlock tank combined the innate tankiness of this class alongside its bonus threat generating ability Searing Pain to allow certain bosses that needed a ranged tank to be possible. The first big hurdle for Warlock tanks to learn was the Twin Emperors in AQ40. These 2 bosses had to be split to either sides of the room, as if they were ever too close they would begin to heal up, and now and again throughout the fights they would teleport and swap position. There was also one caster boss and one melee one. The caster boss was the one the Warlock would be waiting for, and you'd also need to equip a bunch of shadow resist for this boss too, as their main attack hit pretty damn hard. There was the option to go and respec for this encounter to a demonology build where you could pick up talents that would give you 60 bonus shadow resist when using a Fell Hunter, and of course Soul Link to split a bunch of damage. But it was kind of unnecessary and would seriously impact your threat generation, and there was no dual spec back then of course, and you couldn't summon inside of instances either. So yeah, I always opted for just equipping a bunch of shadow resist and hoping the healers kept me alive. Another example of Warlock tanking was Leotheris the Blind during the Burning Crusade, where in his second phase he would transform into a demon and launch AoE fireballs at you. And early on, before people started to outgear this encounter, a lot of people opted for the Warlock tank here. It was a similar situation to Twin Emps, where you needed to put some resist gear on, fire resist this time, and then really just build threat with Searing Pain as much as possible. And even in ICC there was a boss fight that some guilds tried with a locked tank, that being the Blood Council, where one of the bosses launched shadow bolts which did huge amounts of damage, and you had to collect these orbs from around the room to reduce that damage taken. But in my opinion, doing this as a Warlock ended up being more trouble than it was worth, as a Blood DK could do it so much easier, and if anything ever went wrong, they actually had cooldowns to press where they could live. But overall, I enjoyed the flexibility and having the chance to really contribute something a bit more on different bosses now and then. It also made you think about gearing and how best to generate threat, such as lining a Doom tick up with when Leotheris would go into demon form. And lock tanking was just fun to do overall, so that's why I'm picking it here. For Priest, I have a real mean spec, which has kind of never been all that good, but it's been something that people have experimented with time and again, and that is the Smite spec, or Holy DPS Priest, whichever one you want to call it. Priest throughout vanilla and TBC had a bunch of talents in the Holy and Discipline tree, which straight up buff the damage of your Holy spells. These talents improve crit chance, flat damage increases, more spell damage, all of that kind of stuff. And it did seem as though the making of something was there, and people tried it out over the years to see if they could get it to work. In theory, the spec was going to be super simple to play. I mean, to be fair, most casters were during these first 2 expansions, and that would involve pretty much just pressing Smite. Unfortunately, the spec was, well, not very good, and it had a lot of problems. Your mana bar, first of all, it would run out really fast if you were spamming spells. You had 0 bonus hit chance from talents, and hit chance was a harder stat to find, especially early on in vanilla, and you didn't didn't benefit from any of the major debuffs on bosses that people were going to be putting up. I mean, unless you had a Paladin judging Crusader for bonus holy damage, but that in itself was a rare thing, especially in vanilla. In TBC, Blizzard introduced a new and very interesting talent for the Smite Priest called Surge of Light, which was quite far down the holy tree. This would give you a chance for your next smite to be instant cast after a spell crit. And during the early versions of this talent, the smite proc could also crit, so you could get back-to-back procs and just spam instant cast smites one after the other. This also used to proc from using items too, apparently. Unfortunately, Blizzard nerfed both of these interactions pretty early on into TBC, so the one talent that potentially had something going for Smite Priest became kind of just not very good anymore for anything. This kind of reminds me of the whole Gladiator Warrior situation, where if a proper holy DPS priest was going to be a thing, it would probably need its own talent tree to be fully focused around that idea, the Inquisitor or something of the sort perhaps. Either way, Smite Priest has been something that's been tried out time and again throughout World of Warcraft, to very mixed results. Last but not least is the Mage, and Mage has had plenty of weird and wonderful specs over the various expansions, but the one that stands out to me as being both niche and amazing at what it did is most definitely the Pom Pyro Mage, aka the 3-minute Mage. This was a PvP spec which was mainly just for messing about in battlegrounds and seeing some massive crits, but there's just something about one-shotting someone with basically no chance at counterplay that just never felt as though it got old. This mage spec was most popular during vanilla and TBC, and the core of it was going down the arcane tree and picking up both arcane power and the presence of mind talents. Arcane power would give you 30% bonus damage, and presence of mind would make your next spell, which had under a 10-second cast time, instant. And both of these had a 3-minute cooldown, hence the name, the 3-minute mage. Of course, the only spell you wanted to send off instantly was Pyroblast over in the fire tree, which typically had a massive 6-second cast time. I mean, sometimes in PvP you could poly somebody and then hardcast a pyro, but other people could disrupt you, they may be able to trinket and so on. On top of that, if your Pyroblast crit, you had the Ignite talent too, meaning your target would take a bonus 40% of its damage over a few seconds. You'd of course always look to get the Berserking buff in Battlegrounds 2 before finding an unlucky target to test all that damage on. You then put all this together in a macro with any spell power trinkets you had, and that's your Pom Pyro Mage, and the results speak for themselves. This spec definitely wasn't as strong as Frost outside of your cooldowns though, and you were really just invested in that big damage every 3 minutes. But for me, the Pom Pyro Mage has always been a core spec when it comes to PvP in the earlier versions of WoW. And that is it, one weird or off-meta type spec for every class which I felt as though I could cover. Let me know what unique specs you've tried, if anything, in World of Warcraft, and of course if you know of anything that would have been worth a mention for Monk, Demon Hunter or Evoker, drop it down in the comments, I'd love to hear about it, and again we can always do a part 2. I know for every class that I covered today I have multiple choices to go over and I had to settle on one thing. But as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you in the next one very soon.